So I'm so happy to be with you today to talk to you about lobbying. And I have to tell you this very funny story about my book. I live in a little neighborhood where everybody knows each other and everybody knows each other's dogs and everybody has keys to everybody's house. So when my book came out, neighbors were talking about it, and neighbors came up to me and said, "Pat, we heard you got a book published. That's so exciting. What's it about?" And I said, "Lobbying." And they said, "Really? Ugh." And the reason they did is because in their minds, they think this. When they think about lobbying, they think about backroom deals and the seedy underbelly of what goes on in politics. But when I think about lobbying, especially when I think about nonprofits lobbying, I think about it as being our patriotic duty. There's only so much that we can do by helping one person at a time or putting on one performance at a time. We really can make a tremendous impact if we're willing to engage in lobbying. And an example that I like to use is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I have a question. How many people in this room were born before 1990? Most of you, right? And some of you, like me, are old enough to remember that before the ADA was passed, people who were in wheelchairs couldn't even come into an auditorium like this to hear a talk. They couldn't enroll in college. They couldn't go to the supermarket or get on a bus or go to a movie. They were homebound. They were shut-ins just because they were disabled. And this act was passed because of a man named Justin Dart and a nonprofit that he founded. And that little nonprofit got together and they lobbied and passed this law that has had an impact on millions of Americans. But really, when we think about it, it's like a tale of two nonprofits, right? There are the nonprofits that lobby, and then there's the rest of us. And why don't we lobby? Well, I've got theories about that. We're terrified. How many of you fell asleep during high school civics? Right? Who paid attention then? We vote. Sometimes we send money to a candidate. We might even campaign for a candidate. But when it comes to figuring out what goes on in government, we really don't know. We don't understand how laws are made. We're embarrassed because we're adults and we're nonprofit professionals. So we just don't get involved in it. To which I have several very important questions that I need to ask you. The first question is this. How many of you currently own a pet? Raise your hands. Good. For those of you who did not raise your hands, how many of you have ever owned a pet? All right. Anyone still not raising your hand? All right, you're all good. And finally, how many of you are veterinarians? No one? Now, why do I ask these questions? I ask these questions for this reason. You don't need to be a veterinarian to own a pet. And you do not need to know about the intricacies of the legislative process to pass a law. You don't. All you need to know is your cause and be passionate about it, to care about it as much as you care about your pet, and to be able to talk about it in a clear and intelligent manner. So let's start at the beginning about lobbying. First of all, I want everyone to know it's 100% legal for any nonprofit 501c3 organization to lobby. 100% legal. So you can rest assured the day you receive those papers from the IRS, you were authorized to lobby. Now, what is it? What do we mean when we talk about lobbying? Well, very simply, lobbying is attempting to influence legislation. And what's legislation? Well, legislation, very simply, is a law that is proposed or in the process of being made. So some of you will lobby, for instance, for funding for your organization, and you're still lobbying because funding is part of a budget bill. So it actually is a piece of legislation. So we lobby in 4 ways as organizations: by taking a position on a piece of legislation, by communicating with lawmakers about it, by telling the public how to vote on legislation, and urging members of your own nonprofit to vote. So all of those activities constitute lobbying. Now, the IRS, in its wisdom, has decided that there are 2 ways that nonprofits can lobby. And as you can see from this first slide, the first is called the murky, I added the word murky, insubstantial test. So what this means is the IRS says that you, as a nonprofit board member or staff member, may spend an insignificant amount of your resources lobbying. So how much is that? You say 2%? You say 5%? You said 15%. I have no idea. Why? Because the IRS doesn't tell us what they mean by insubstantial. We have another option, which is every other 501c3 corporation, other than religious institutions, so if you're a church or synagogue or a mosque, can't do this, but everybody else can fill out this very complicated paperwork. And I'm only kidding, because this is a 1-line form. And this form is for the expenditure test, otherwise known as 501H, as in have at it, have fun, go lobby. And if you fill out this simple 1-line form, and if you do it today, it's retroactive to January 1st of the year, which is really great. And what this does, it allows you to spend 20% of the first $500,000 of your operating budget on lobbying. Wow, that is a crazy amount of money. And it also gives you a lot of latitude and very clear guidelines on what constitutes lobbying and what you can do. Now, because the IRS never does anything simply, there are rules to this too. And it defines ways in which you can lobby. So the first way is called direct lobbying, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Direct lobbying is when you go directly to the lawmaker or his or her legislative aide, and you lobby. You're going to the decision maker. So in the case of a nonprofit working on a ballot question, who's the decision maker? It's me and you. It's the general public. So if you go directly to the general public to lobby on a ballot question, you're directly lobbying. If you talk directly to a city council person or a state rep or somebody at the federal level or one of their aides, you're directly lobbying. That's direct lobbying. Now, the other kind of lobbying is called grassroots lobbying. And a lot of people think, well, when I talk to my members, they're my grassroots. Wrong answer. The grassroots are people who are beyond your members. So if you say to your members, and I want you to tell your mother and your friends and everybody you know to go out and do something, vote yes on this or on this bill or call up and influence something, then you're engaged in grassroots lobbying. Now, there's a very technical term that we use, and it's called a call to action. And a call to action means that you're asking people to make a phone call, write a letter, sign a petition, send a fax. Do people send telegrams? I don't know. But take direct action. So whenever you're asking people to take direct action on a particular piece of legislation, you are lobbying. Now, the IRS says you can spend 100% of all of that money that we talked about earlier, the 20% of your operating costs, on direct lobbying, and you can spend a quarter of it on grassroots lobbying. But you can see from my explanation that most of the time you're going to be engaged in direct lobbying, not in grassroots lobbying. You can do all kinds of other things too. You can go door to door. You can ring people's doorbells and you can say, hey, we're working on this campaign. and we're trying to pass this legislation because it's really important for the environment. And we'd like you to donate money to our cause. None of that is lobbying. It only becomes lobbying when you ask them to do something, when you make a call to action. So if you say, "Anne, we'd like you to sign this petition or write a letter or make a phone call," then you're lobbying. So the thing to remember is, if you have direct contact with the legislator who is making the decision, you're lobbying. Or if you're asking people to have direct contact with that person, with the ultimate decision maker, then you're lobbying. Now, under the 501H, have at it, have fun, go lobby, you're not lobbying when you're influencing regulations. You're communicating with your members about a bill that you're working on. You're testifying. Now, this is a little caveat to it. How many of you have ever served on a committee? Okay, everybody in this room, I can see. So the legislature at any level, whether it's a city council or Congress, works according to committees. And it's not difficult to figure out what committee your bill is going to land on. So it might be a committee on the environment or public safety or human resource or human services. And so a lot of times, because of the work that you do in the nonprofit community, you are an expert. And so that committee might ask you to come in to testify on a bill. And if they ask you to testify, that all of that time that you spend writing up your testimony or going to the state capitol, that does not count under your lobbying limits. Doing research, we're going to talk a lot later on about different kinds of research that you're going to do to bolster your campaign. So all of the time that you spend doing that research, preparing any kinds of papers or documents to make your case, that doesn't count as lobbying. And then finally, self-defense lobbying. And what self-defense lobbying is, it's when the government is proposing a law that's going to fundamentally alter or challenge the ability of your nonprofit to exist. So if you are, for instance, a community health center and they're changing the reimbursement formulas from Medicaid, then you could lobby all you wanted to on that issue without that counting. A lot of times people will ask me, well, won't the IRS be more likely to audit me if I file this 501H form? And the answer is no. We've done a lot of research, and we haven't found any evidence that the IRS is more likely to audit you if you file the 501H. Then some people say, but wait a minute, my audit costs are already really high, and it's going to be so much more expensive if I file the 501H. And that's just wrong. It's actually, if you're engaged in lobbying, your audit costs will be lower. And the reason they'll be lower is because all of these costs are counted, and you have to add them up on your 990 if you're under that murky and substantial test. But if you're under this 501H, have at it, have fun, go lobby, none of these expenses are counted. So the one thing you can never, ever do is to endorse a candidate for office. You can do all kinds of other things. You can have candidate debates. You can send out questionnaires to candidates. There's certain ways they need to be formatted, so I don't want to get into too much technical detail here. But there are all kinds of things you can do. You can survey candidates. You can publish their responses on your website or in your newsletter. You don't have to say, yes, and vote for Pat Libby because she's got the curliest hair. But your member should be smart enough to figure out who is going to be supportive of your cause based on their responses. Now, as you all know, money is pretty much the key to everything in life, right? Right? So where do you get the money to lobby? Well, get it from membership dues and donations. So all of that soft money that's donated to you, you can use for lobbying. Special events. You can have a car wash, a bake sale, yard sale, any kind of that special event activity, gala, all of that money can be used for lobbying. Foundations. Now, I know everyone is shocked by this because you get these letters from private foundations that say, and be sure that none of this money can be used for lobbying. Now, there's a reason that they do that. And the reason is they're totally confused because the law doesn't restrict them from funding lobbying. So for purposes of the IRS and lobbying, there are two kinds of foundations. First, there are community foundations. And community foundations are public charities just like any other 501c3. So community foundations can elect the 501h. They can spend 20% of their core operating funds, up to $17 million, funding you to do lobbying. Pretty cool. Now, private foundations are also allowed to fund lobbying activities. What they can't do is they can't write out a check and say, this check is to support lobbying. Can't do that. But they can give you a check for operating support, even though you have asked for funding to support a legislative campaign. In other words, it's perfectly legal for them to fund a legislative campaign as long as the money that is directed to you is for operating support. Now, by law, they can't fund 100% of that campaign, but they can fund most of it, so maybe 60% of it, and maybe another foundation will fund the other 40% of it. Or maybe the other 40% will come from membership dues and donations or a car wash and a bake sale or whatever it is that you do. So foundations can fund lobbying. Now, this slide is my favorite slide in the whole show. And I lovingly refer to it as the duh slide. And the reason it's called the duh slide is because of this. You cannot use government money to lobby the government. Duh. And a lot of people get confused about this because they say, but wait, I have block grant money, so I can't lobby. No, you can't use the block grant money to lobby, but you can use the money from the membership dues and donations and the bake sales and the car wash and the gala to lobby. You can't use county government money to lobby the federal government or the city government, so no government money can be used to lobby the government. But all those other sources of money can be used for lobbying. Okay, so after today, I know you're going to leave here all fired up. You're going to sit and you're going to have a conversation with your staff and your board, and hopefully you're going to decide to make the 501h election. You are going to figure out what the laws are for your city, state, and county government. For example, I know some city governments, if you contact a city council person 10 times in a month on an issue, you have to register as a lobbyist. Oh, don't worry, you're not going to turn into that big guy, you know, smoking a cigar. You can register as a lobbyist, it's okay, but just make sure that you understand what the laws are so that you don't violate them. Now, and you're going to figure out what forms you need in order to track your time and expenses. I love these people at the Alliance for Justice. These people are wonderful. They're a nonprofit organization, and their purpose in life is to help you figure out how to lobby. So if you want to call them up and say, we are putting this on our website, is it a call to action? They'll walk you through all of that. They're attorneys, they're kind, they're just wonderful. So don't call me if you have a technical question. Call them and they will straighten you up. Okay, now I want to talk about lobbying strategy because this is the most fun part, at least for me. And many of you know that I'm a pracademic. I come from practice. I ran nonprofits for 17 years and was a consultant long before I became an academic. And when I became an academic and I started teaching lobbying, and I teach a course and you're going to hear about my students, I was looking for a textbook, and I couldn't find one. And so I basically thought, well, geez, what did I do when I was lobbying? And I wrote these 10 steps on a piece of paper, gave it to my students, and they started using it and passing one bill after another. And eventually, one of my students said to me, gee, Pat, you really ought to write a book. So I did. And in the book, I talk about the 10-step framework. And I wrote it not only for students, but for practitioners, anyone who is a volunteer or a staff person for a nonprofit organization, because this is a very effective, low-cost strategy that anyone can use to pass legislation. And I want nonprofits to get more involved in this process. So when I started to write about the framework, I used bowling pins, I used 10 Commandments, I used all kinds of analogies. And I called it the 10 steps. And what I wish I had done, and if I ever get the opportunity to revise the book for a second edition, what I'm going to do is talk about it in terms of dance steps. Because it really is, and you'll see as I go through it, it really is more like a dance. It's not like steps in that you go through them and you're just on your path or you're checking them off the list. You're kind of circling back around as you go through the process. So it really is more like a dance. So the first step is to identify the issue. And a lot of times we think the issue in front of us is an obvious issue. We're seeing clients at a social service agency who are having the same problem over and over again. But we might talk to those clients and say, hey, I hear you're having the same problem over and over again. Do you think we should do something to fix it? And they might say, yeah, we are having that problem. But the bigger problem is this. And you've missed the forest for the trees. So you need to sit down and have a conversation with people to make sure the issue that you think is a problem, they think is a problem. You might call somebody at another agency and they might say, hey, we solved that problem with an administrative fix. Just do this and that and you'll be fine. You'll say, thank you, hang up the phone. Sometimes you have to survey people because you want to figure out how big is this problem? How pervasive is it in our community? So you have to figure out how to identify the issue, and is the issue really an issue? And then once you identify it, then you've got to do research on it. And the reason you have to do research is because you want to document the problem. Now, sometimes you can call on colleagues like me or other academics who will have done research on a particular issue. And you'll be able to use that research to present the facts of your case to the people that you're lobbying. You want to give as much information as possible to the legislators and their aides so that they can make the case for you. So you are doing your legwork. And yes, you want to have footnotes and documents, and you want to have a good case that talks about why it's important to pass this particular piece of legislation. And you're going to use all this research to produce two documents. One is a fact sheet, and the other one is a white paper, you can call it a position paper, research paper, that will have the broader information on your issue. So let's look at the fact sheet. Now, I mentioned briefly my students, and let me tell you a little bit about them. As you know, I direct the Institute for Nonprofit Education and Research at the University of San Diego. And one of the components of the Institute is our graduate degree in nonprofit leadership and management. And our students are working professionals. They are already in managerial positions for a variety of nonprofit organizations. Sometimes they move here from Iran and China to be in the program, or Chicago, exotic places, San Francisco. Other times, they're already from San Diego, but after they land here, all but the international students get jobs, or if the ones who live here already have jobs, and they are managing people, organizations, foundations, programs, departments, finance, what have you. And they study with us during evenings and on some weekends. So several years ago, I had a student who wanted to enroll in my course, my advocacy course, because of a problem that she was seeing at her nonprofit organization. And the problem was this. She worked for a nonprofit organization that served adults with developmental disabilities. And occasionally, she would have a staff member who was just terrible. Somebody who was very cruel to the clients. A person might give a client a bath in freezing cold water, or pull the person's hair, you know, do things that you did not want to have done to that client or within the organization. And she would document the situation. She would write them up. Somebody from the state would come in. They would verify that the person should be terminated. They would be terminated. And then a month later, she would go down the block and she'd be having a meeting at another organization that served developmentally disabled adults. And she'd see the staff person, sometimes working with the same person. And she said to me, Pat, I need to enroll in your course because why on God's green earth are there protections and central registries for people who work with seniors or people who work with children, but there's no registry of these people who have had these kind of employment infractions for people who work with the developmentally disabled. And I want to create a registry in California to address this problem. So she enrolled in my course, and she attracted a team, a group of other students, to work with her on their campaign. And they called it the REACH Project, the Registry to End Abusive Caregiver Hiring. The idea was to create a central registry for these employees, these abusive employees. And you can see from their fact sheet, they had very simple description of the problem. So they talked about the background, alarming statistics, the problem, the solution. They created this very simple chart. You can see their protections for children and the elderly, but none for the developmentally disabled. And then on the back of the fact sheet, her research and that of her teammates found that there were a number of states that already had these kinds of laws in place, frequently asked questions, members of her coalition, and references, and obviously ways to contact them. Now this fact sheet was the Cliff Notes version, or the synthesis of their bigger white paper that outlined all of this situation in much greater detail. And fact sheets are so important. You know, we live in this information age where everyone's flashing their cell phones and their iPads and so on. But when you go to lobby, you need to have a very simple piece of paper that's double-sided that just is the synthesis of the story that you want to convey to the legislator or their aides. It's really simple and effective. So the next step is to brand the issue. So this is where it gets a little bit backwards. Now I told you that she called it, or she and her team branded this the REACH Project. And the reason they did was because they wanted a name for their campaign that would be short and memorable. And so that every time she called up to talk about the campaign, she could say, hi, this is Maureen from REACH, rather than saying, this is Maureen from the Registry to End Abusive Caregiver Hiring, right? Someone's already on their second cup of coffee by the time she's finished that long name. So you want to brand it with a short name that's memorable, and legislators can use as shorthand for remembering your cause, and that's branding it. Now, really good brands will be able to frame your issue as well. So, for instance, we used to have something in this country, and we still do, called the inheritance tax. That was changed dramatically when it was called the death tax. And all of a sudden, it was changed, right? Because of the way it was named and framed. Many, many, many communities have a living wage ordinance. And think about that, what a clever phrase that was. They could have called it raising the wage to lift people out of poverty. But some brilliant person came up with living wage as a way of naming and framing that issue. So when you name an issue, you not only want to think about the issue and how you're trying to capture the essence of your campaign, but you also want to think about what your opposition might be and what their arguments might be, because sometimes you can name your issue in such a way that it gets ahead of the arguments. And that really takes us to the next step, which is mapping. You're going to do two kinds of mapping. And there's all kinds of, you can go online, you can find a software that you can use for mapping. I just like to use either a big sheet of paper or whiteboard or whatever. And I like to try to sit with a group and figure out, okay, who's going to be in favor of this issue? Because those are the groups that we're going to be able to call up and say, hey, will you join our coalition? Will you activate your networks? Will you get people involved in this? So who's going to be in favor of this? Who's going to be opposed to us? And why? And what are their arguments going to be? And is there anything that we can do to get those people who are in opposition over to our side? And are there people in the middle that we don't know which side they're going to go on? So that is one kind of mapping that you want to do. Now, I want to give you an example of another campaign that another group of students worked on. And this was a law that a group of students of mine passed a few years ago. And one of my students was employed by a nonprofit that worked to provide support to people who track child pornography. So you can imagine if that's what you did for a living, it's just emotionally exhausting. And the number of incidences of child pornography with toddlers and infants is astonishing. It is creepy and appalling and makes me so sad I can't stand it. So they looked at the law in California, and the law said that film developers were mandated reporters. Okay, well, when's the last time that any of you took your camera to Rite Aid or CVS to have your film developed? Right? You don't do that anymore. Everyone does it on the web. So they decided that computer repair technicians should be mandated reporters. So if someone is repairing a laptop and up pops child pornography, they are mandated to report that. Makes sense, doesn't it? So they started to work on this law. And who popped up in opposition? The pornography industry. Why? Because they said, we don't want an 18-year-old woman who is dressed up like a little girl to be caught in this kind of dragnet. I said, okay. Students said, we'll say that the images are of girls who are 16 and under. Done. Who else popped up? Best Buy. Best Buy said, what if one of our repair techs takes someone's computer and finds that it wasn't pornography after all? We don't want to be sued, and we don't want to be held liable for that. They said, okay, we can do something that write the law so that if the computer is taken in good faith with reasonable cause, the company can't be sued. And that's that. So they were able to figure out what the opposition was going to be. They were able to negotiate with these people. And now that is a law. And I'm very proud of them because that's a law that is going to protect many, many children by cracking down on child pornographers. So when you map, you're thinking about all those things. Who's going to be on our side? And by the way, Best Buy testified in favor of this legislation, so my students were able to take them from a negative over to the plus side. Right? So you're going to do that mapping. The second kind of mapping that you're going to do has to do with the legislature. Now, as I mentioned before, the world works according to committees. There's committees for everything. So you're just going to take your best bet at where your bill is going to go. And you're going to do some research on those people. And, you know, being in the internet age, this kind of stuff is so easy. You can just go onto the search engine of the legislature, and you can find out how do these people vote. You can put in the search words and find out if there have been other bills, similar kinds of bills that were attempted in the past and who authored them on similar topics. You can go on the home pages of all of these legislators and find out not only where they live, but what they stand for and all about them. And you can create little profiles on them. Now, I think you know that legislators not only want to serve the public, they also want to get reelected. So you have to make sure that when you're targeting a legislator, that you either are registered to vote in that person's district, or you have colleagues who are registered to vote in that person's district. Because you know, as intelligent and well-prepared as you are, they're going to be more receptive to you if you have constituents that vote in their district. It's just common sense. So you're going to do all that mapping and preparation because you want to try to figure out whether or not this legislator or that legislator will agree to author or sponsor a bill. Same thing. Then you're going to form a coalition, and we talked a little bit about this earlier when we were doing our mapping. And the best coalition are coalitions of odd bedfellows. And what I mean by that is, if you're all affordable housing groups, you want to team up with environmentalists. If you're working on a public safety issue and you're a bunch of nonprofits, you want to team up with a sheriff's department. So you want to try to get people from different facets of the issue to be part of your coalition. Because if you don't, a lot of times the legislators will say, these nonprofits are doing it just because they're protecting their own jobs. It's something I find very insulting, but I've heard it time and again. So you really want to make sure that you have a very broad coalition of interests that are going with you to promote your cause. Okay, you've done all this research. You're like walking encyclopedias with brilliance. You've got facts and figures and white papers and everything. And you've got to boil it down so that if your mom wants to make a phone call on the issue, she knows what to say. Or members of your organization, or friends of members of your organization, or people you serve. So you're going to prepare very simple talking points, which will enable people to put in their own words why this particular issue is important to them. You want to get some media. And you don't have to go on TV, but getting print media is wonderful. Several years ago, students of mine passed a very important environmental bill. It had to do with tires and tire recycling. So in California, we have a law that every time you buy a tire, you pay a small fee, you don't even realize it, that goes for tire recycling. So many of the tires are recycled by putting them on trucks, driving them to Mexico, and dumping them. Yay, great for the environment, right? Well, what was happening is that a lot of those tires were being dumped in Tijuana, right along the Tijuana River. The Tijuana River happens to flow north. So once in a while, even though we don't get a lot of rain here, sometimes we'll get a deluge. We're expecting one this week, as a matter of fact. And when there were big deluges, the Tijuana River would swell, and the tires would flow north, and they would flow into San Diego and be dumped all over an estuary. And this nonprofit, where my student of mine worked, had to use, hundreds and hundreds of volunteers to clean up this sensitive estuary. So they said there's got to be something that can be done. And they got attention for this issue. They got a front page story in the San Diego Union Tribune right before they went up to Sacramento to lobby. And I think partly because of that great media coverage, so when they arrived in Sacramento to lobby, people had read that article. Legislators had seen it. And of course, they brought copies with them so that people could see that coverage. And that was really influential in enabling them to pass a law that allowed California to establish tire recycling facilities on this side of the border and to spend money in Mexico to address the problem. Wonderful. So then after you do all that, you're going to meet with your legislators. And every year when I go to the state capitol with my students and we come back, I'm always really happy and really sad when my students say to me over and over, I can't believe how nice they were. I can't believe how respectful they were. I can't believe how they listened to us. And they wanted our opinion. And they asked us intelligent questions. Yeah, that's why people run for office. They really want to make society better. And they may not have your political views, but if you take the time to research your issue, build a good coalition around you, get people geared up so they can speak eloquently about the issue, get media attention, these people will listen to you. And if you're lucky enough to find a legislator who will author a bill for you, then their legislative aide will be your Sherpa. I love these people. They're your guide, right? They will help you. They'll tell you every step of the way in the process. So you don't need to understand how to translate your idea into legalese. There's an office that does that for you. So the legislative aide will tell you every step of the way what you need to do next. And you'll be on a first-name basis with that person. You'll probably go to their wedding and baby shower and all that kind of stuff because you're going to develop a really close relationship with them. They're going to rely on you because you're going to be the expert on the issue. And they will shepherd you through that process. And by the way, if you go to the state capitol or city hall or your county government, wherever you're going, and you don't get to meet with the elected official, you only get to meet with their aide, don't be disappointed. Because those aides are worth their weight in gold and will help you and be your advocate for your issue. So they're wonderful people. So there you are. That's your roadmap to lobbying. And I'm going to end with this slide, and I end with this slide for two reasons. One is to remind you, you don't have to be a veterinarian to own a pet, and you don't need to understand all of the intricacies of the legislative process to pass a law. And the second reason I end with this slide is because I can. Thank you.